Welcome to our webinar with our friends and partners at Concord Agriculture Partners. We're going to be talking about taking the carbon out of coffee and how to design a coffee decarbonization project in Brazil. As some of you know, people who are familiar with Proba, this is a really exciting topic for us. I know we talk about fertilizers quite a lot, so I'm really keen to approach this in a practical manner where we can show you how to go about having a project. Now, we have two fantastic speakers, Sijbrand and Kevin, but before I slightly introduce them, I would like to mention that we will have a Q&A section at the end. I welcome and encourage everyone to ask their questions throughout the webinar, and we will have 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer all of your questions. You can leave your questions either anonymously or with your name. If we don't answer your questions during the webinar, we'll try to follow up with you if we have your names. And I will show the slide again at the end to remind you how to get to the Q&A section. So we'll get to that when we're there. All right. Next slide, Kevin. So today we have two fantastic speakers. We have Kevin, who is the partner and co-founder at Concord Agriculture Partners. And we have our CEO and co-founder at Proba, Sijbrand. And I think without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Sijbrand.
Yes. Hey there. I think maybe, Erna, you can confirm that the sound is working, okay?
I can't hear Sijbrand.
Okay. We can hear you, Sijbrand.
All right. Good to know.
Okay. Hi there. Thanks, Erna, for the introduction, and hi everybody who is signed on or responded to the webinar. Welcome everybody. I think we're like 46 people live right now, which is super. I think there's a lot of, I would say, AI agents, robots taking notes at the moment. So that's definitely a change since, I would say, the first webinar we did like a couple of years ago. So also welcome robots, but the real people, nice to have you in the meeting, in the webinar. We have people from all over the world, so that's also nice. And maybe as a small heads up, we will talk a lot about coffee. We will talk a lot about fertilizer, but I think it's transparent to say and honest to say that this webinar will be also a lot about commercials, also how you basically design a project in the coffee sector in Brazil, but also make sure that everybody involved is actually, I would say, financially incentivized in a way that these things can actually happen and can scale. Therefore, I'm super happy that Kevin, he needs to spell out his last name in a few minutes himself, because that's super difficult, but Kevin from Concord is here as well, telling you guys on how to structure a project like this, but also how to kind of finance a project like this. So I think that's one of the key aspects here. So a bit different compared to other webinars where we dive deep into, I would say, the science and the technologies of the actual fertilizer technologies and solutions. This webinar is a bit more about, okay, how do you structure a project and how do you basically involve everybody in the supply chain to make things happen at scale. Anyway, on Proba, for the new people, we're a company from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and we certify Scope 3 impact in the agri-food supply chain. Basically, we enable many stakeholders in the supply chain, so all the way from upstream fertilizer producers, farmer cooperatives, traders, but also food companies and brands to kind of find solutions to reduce emissions in the supply chain, and specifically around fertilizer-related emissions. So we quantify these solutions and we certify these solutions to be able to kind of support Scope 3 emission reduction claims across the supply chain. So that is Proba. Next slide, please. This webinar is about, how can you reduce emissions in the coffee supply chain in Brazil? Maybe to dive a bit deeper into the coffee supply chain there. It's a large sourcing area, so there's millions of hectares there. But also, if you look at fertilizer use in coffee growing in Brazil, there's a lot there, and maybe too much. But anyway, it's a big source of emissions. So if you look at coffee and also the coffee you drink every day, a large part of the emissions are actually directly or indirectly related to fertilizers. So if you want to kind of tackle or make the coffee more sustainable, fertilizers is one of the big, I would say the first emission sources that you want to take a look at. So that's what we try to find out today on what kind of solutions are there and how to scale programs to reduce these emissions across the supply chain. Next slide, please. Maybe a bit technical. I think many people know, but sometimes it's still somewhat surprising to people acting in the supply chain. So, of course, fertilizers, there are many kinds of fertilizers, but we basically are looking at nitrogen-based fertilizers in the context of emissions. So that's typically urea or NPK blends, which are also widely used in Brazil. And if you look at the emission or the footprint of these fertilizers, there's basically two main parts that you need to take a look at. It's the production emissions, so emissions that happen when you make or produce the fertilizers, and there's the in-field emissions, of emissions that happen when farmers are using the fertilizers. And with nitrogen-based fertilizers, you see a lot of nitrous oxide being released during the use of fertilizers. So there's good reason to take a look at those and also reduce these emissions in the field. Next slide, please. So if you look at these emissions, there's lots of technologies out there that can reduce these emissions. I think most of the work that we do, and also the work that we do with Kevin, with Concord, is around introducing technologies on the field at farmer level that reduce emissions in the field. These technologies are called nitrogen stabilizers, sometimes also called inhibitors or controlled release fertilizers, CRF. And these technologies typically reduce emissions with around 40%. And if you kind of do the math, it amounts to approximately half a metric ton of CO2 equivalent per ton of green beans coffee. So per ton of coffee that's coming from the fields in Brazil. So significant emission source, but also a significant, you could say, opportunity to start looking at these emissions and find solutions, technologies to reduce these emissions. Next slide. I would say the most simple one, to a certain extent, is introduce or switch to low carbon nitrogen fertilizers. So basically, use fertilizers which are produced in a more sustainable way, for instance, with renewable energy, where the production process is a lot more clean than traditional conventional fertilizer production. There's some available there, but and you can definitely take a look at this, and you should if you're active in the coffee supply chain. But there's also big caveat: it's somewhat expensive still, and also the availability of these low emission, low carbon nitrogen fertilizer is still pretty limited. Next slide, please. If you look at another thing that I think many actors in the supply chain are looking at is improving NUE. So basically, use less nitrogen and still maintain yield. So there's many, I would say, interventions that you can do as a farmer to be, I would say, a bit more practical with how much nitrogen-based fertilizer you use while still maintaining the yields that you want to basically bring to the market. This is basically the farmer and the agronomists, I would say, working together to find, I would say, solutions that improve NUE. Next slide, please. Things that we as Proba have been doing a lot of work together with the industry and the scientific community is around nitrogen stabilizers. So those are the inhibitors, ureas inhibitors, and nitrification inhibitors. Basically, these slow down the nitrous oxide emissions, so the in-field emissions that would happen if you would use nitrogen-based fertilizers. So a tremendous amount of emissions that are being reduced if these pretty common technologies would be used by farmers in Brazil or elsewhere. Next slide, please. Another related technology is a technology which is called controlled release fertilizer. It's basically in the same realm of what we call enhanced efficiency fertilizers. Again, similar, if you compare it to traditional fertilizer, much of the nitrogen gets basically lost, is not being, I would say, used by the plant when it grows, by the crop when in the growing season. Controlled release fertilizers are coated fertilizers, nitrogen-based fertilizers, which release nutrients more, I would say, in line with what the plant actually needs, and the result is less, I would say, nitrous oxide emissions when during the growing season. Next slide, please. So there's quite a few technologies or interventions out there which reduce fertilizer-related emissions tremendously. I think the nice thing is that many of these don't require enormous practice changes by farmers. So most of these technologies are readily available, also in Brazil. And I think the other, interesting thing is that the premium for these inputs typically are in the range of $30 to $50 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent that gets reduced because of these technologies. So also there, I think there's an opportunity for the supply chain to kind of really take a good look at these technologies and convince everybody in the supply chain to kind of invest and make sure that these technologies are being adapted by the farmers. I think that's also kind of next slide, I would say the logical handover to Kevin, because as we look at it as Proba, the solution and the opportunity is relatively simple if you compare it to other, I would say, abatement technologies. But what is necessary, of course, is an approach, is a developer, is a stakeholder who can basically make sure that the change happens, and therefore. And looks at all the, I would say, other aspects of developing a project like this. And therefore, I would happily introduce everybody to Kevin from Concord Ag.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Like many of you, coffee is a topic and product that is near and dear to my heart and the heart of our functioning at Concord Agriculture Partners as a boutique consulting firm based in Chicago. And we are a partnership-based company that develops high-integrity global programs for insetting, as well as offsetting and regenerative agriculture in agribusiness supply chains globally. We work with multinationals on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, implementing regenerative agriculture heavily around reforestation, afforestation, and improved forest management, as well as improving animal agriculture outcomes and working on soil health and fertilizer efficiency, hence our partnership with Proba. And on top of that, we work with innovative supply chain finance mechanisms to bring the solutions to the table to enable the transition to a more resilient supply chain around the world. And as I mentioned, we take a partnership-based approach to deliver client solutions. We bring together the right teams in the right places to achieve the outcomes that our clients are looking for. And we focus on program implementation and environmental asset creation. A bit more about my background and the background of our partners. At Concord, I led sustainability sourcing at Barry Callebaut. So I worked in a B2B position for over 5 years in the Americas, working with upstream and downstream supply chain partners to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions, insetting goals, and implementing regenerative agriculture. We have a team of experts around greenhouse gas emissions reduction technologies and accounting on our team, as well as implementing programs related to regenerative agriculture. So when we think about developing a supply chain program, it's really important to acknowledge that there are challenges in designing any type of sustainability project. We're working with a dynamic system affected by market conditions, the weather, as well as supply chain complexity. On top of that, we're dealing with change management, working with farmers to change behaviors. In this instance, working on adjusting the type of fertilizer that they apply and bringing together and plugging the missing incentives, paying farmers for the practice change, because there are added costs to this type of transition in the short term and medium terms. And when we think about what makes a decarbonization project successful, we at Concord think about 5 specific elements. One is that we have a scalable intervention. As we reach scale and gain in our scale, we're able to lower the overhead costs. So more money goes to the farmers, and the overall cost per unit of reduction is decreased for the end user and retailers, so that we have a value-based deal. 2, we're dealing with complex supply chains, not only from coffee farmers downstream to brands and retailers through traders and roasters, but also upstream from the farmers through fertilizer distributors, the fertilizer manufacturers, to those who bring out the who mine the energy needed for fertilizer production. And then 3, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. This is the absolute important foundation for any credible program, so that the farmers know exactly what they need to do, how they need to report it, and that there's verification so that the downstream actors in the value chain have confidence that the intervention that they're paying for and or supporting in some way or another is actually happening. And 4, emission accounting and claiming, so that we meet the needs of the value chain from a regulatory perspective and voluntary markets related to SBTI goals and the greenhouse gas protocol, to ensure that what is coming out of the program within a specific supply shed meets the needs of the end users. And finally, financing. As mentioned before by Sijbrand, these fertilizers that reduce overall emissions, the leading emission sources in coffee, do require an increase in cost at the farm gate level. So when we think about coffee emissions, we have to start where the emissions are, and that is fertilizer as your first step in a value chain engagement. By switching from conventional urea to a stabilized urea or controlled release fertilizer, we can reduce emissions by up to 40%. And this is a decision that is made annually by the farmer to reduce emissions for their own production and to meet the goals of brands, retailers, and others in the value chain who have set similar goals. And it's an immediate outcome rather than waiting multiple years for trees to grow or soil carbon to accumulate. This happens within the annual decision by farmers to apply fertilizer. Now, when we're creating this program, it's important to note that we're dealing with 2 distinct supply chains. One is from the fertilizer producer to the farmer, and the second is from the farmer to roasters, brands, and retailers. Now, there's complexity and change management that we as the project developer manage on behalf of the farmers and the buyers of the insets and emission reductions. This is a cost-saving exercise for anyone interested in these types of outcomes, because we as a program developer and owner actually take on all the change management processes and working with both of these complex supply chains. Because when we think about it, the intervention is unfamiliar and complex to non-agronomists. There's concerns by the farmers and uncertainty as to who pays. And the MRV and auditing overhead are daunting. It's an entirely new skill set for farmers and farmer associations to undertake. And there are misaligned incentives across all the different stakeholders, from the fertilizer sales to the cooperatives and aggregators and distributors of fertilizer to the farmers. And then when we pivot after the farmer has applied the fertilizer to the roasters, brands, and retailers, the downstream actors feel removed from farm level decisions. There are tens of thousands and millions of coffee farmers around the world, depending on the origin that we're looking at. There are traceability challenges that make the impact hard to track as it moves through the supply chain to the retailer and point of sale. There's uncertainty about the outcomes of the interventions when farmers decide to apply certain fertilizers. We need to have a robust system that underpins our ability to have high confidence of high integrity outcomes to ensure that what brands and retailers pay for to meet their SBTI goals and regulatory compliance goals actually occurs on the ground. And on top of that, we at Concord Agriculture Partners, based on our background in the actual commercial sector, know that commercial flexibility is key to align incentives, because your origins and as a buyer of coffee are going to shift from year to year, depending on based on volumes and a whole array of factors. And we can build a program to meet those commercial realities. In essence, what Concord Agriculture does is we solve supply chain complexity. We take the friction out of a carbon project married up to a supply chain. We connect the coffee farmers to the fertilizer distributors. We work together to meet the market demand for the total emission reductions. We create an MRV system that collects just the appropriate amount of data needed to have a high integrity reduction without overburdening the farmer or the farm cooperative support teams with data collection overload. And we manage and herd the cats through program validation and verification, working with external consultants, third-party validator and verifier that is accredited to the Proba methodologies, and working with the farmers. We're able to work with roasters and brands to co-finance the interventions so that we can share claims up through the value chain. And we do this by creating serialized emission reductions to avoid double counting and ensure high integrity outcomes to be allocated to specific supply chains that we can build emission reductions for. And we ensure that the funds are distributed to farmers based on the purchases and outcomes of the inset credits. Now, how this looks in practice. This year, we at Concord Agriculture Partners with Proba will start a program in the center south of Brazil, targeting both Colonão and Arabica coffee, starting with 10,000 plus hectares. It is our ambition to grow this program to 500,000 hectares or 500,000 hectares by the end of 2030. And we're going to do this by working with the industry to apply better fertilizer, support farmers in adopting the practices by meeting them where they're at with trusted advisors. We'll be engaging the market, such as many of you on this call, for buyers to recognize this improvement. And we'll be providing the strong governance of a program that you can trust in the outcomes based on our track record in the industry over the last several years. And through this process, we'll be delivering great results for the industry and for the climate. When we think about MRV, this is a key element of any program and often overlooked in creating insetting projects or to create emission factor reductions or specific inset credits. The MRV doesn't necessarily have to be challenging because most data already exists on well-managed farms and farms that have effective support from their co-ops and associations. We'll start with a known farmer list and the area and coffee volume that is produced annually, and we'll maintain those yield data throughout the lifespan of the project. We'll get invoices from distributors to know exactly what fertilizer was purchased, the amount, the product type, and compare that to the baseline of higher emitting fertilizers. We'll know the application timing and dosage so that it complies and conforms with the Proba methodology, and we'll undertake random field checks in keeping with industry global best practices. Now, of critical nature to the industry is understanding the emission counting and claiming, because through the Proba methodology, we will help the coffee sector credibly, with high integrity outcomes, account and claim for the outcomes from this project. We're targeting Scope 3 emission reductions in aligning with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the recently released land sector removal guidance, and the Science-Based Target Initiative. Claiming we'll have one reduction with one owner, and we'll be able to go through the chain of custody to share claims along the way and enable us to put this on the Proba registry. And it's not just less emissions, it's a great business case too. When we think about sustainability and coffee, they go hand in hand. In the US, where I consume the vast majority of my coffee, 50 to 70% of the coffee has some level of sustainability claim. And when we're talking about Proba and the methodology we've just presented to you today, at the retail level, at the very high end of the price of a carbon inset, it is approximately 0.24% of the cost of a coffee bag at retail. And that means 2 cents. So when I or my fellow Midwesterners go to the grocery store, we would only see a 2-cent increase. And I can guarantee you, the vast majority of consumers would not notice this, and you would be able to make a claim for significant emission reductions in your coffee. When we think about the other advantages of this program to the coffee sector, we can, through a scalable program, we are able to save companies significant expenditures. We know that sustainability budgets are tight, and that's why we at Concord Agriculture Partners are stepping up to create this high integrity, incredibly impactful outcome program to create this project and outcomes for the sector. We know that these projects can be $250,000 up to $500,000 just to stand up. And then on top of that, the upfront fertilizer costs that farmers will be implementing to develop the outcomes also vary based on the type of product, the retailer, and region in which they're farming. So what we're looking for in this program is to enable, through the end buyer commitments, the ability to get external bridge financing, and that we would coordinate that financing with the offtake agreements, and that the buyers and demand and brands can act now to start securing emission reductions going forward into the future to meet your SBTI goals and improve your regulatory reporting, while also securing the future of coffee, because we know that coffee is significantly impacted by climate change. So with the sector leading the way in this type of program, we're able to create a high value, high impact program. And we know how this program can work because we've been there. We've walked through this based on our experience at Barry Callebaut and as Concord Agriculture Partners. And we know what works and what doesn't work. First and foremost, we always need to remember the farmer, because they're the ones who are making the decisions and putting the initial capital at risk of changing fertilizer types. We need to manage the expectations with supply and demand. It can be easy to create a supply of carbon insets. However, if the demand is not there, within 1 or 2 years, farmers will start to walk away from the program. So we at Concord Agriculture Partners are intentionally developing this program so as to match supply and demand. Scalability is key, so we can bring down the cost of the program over time for both the farmers and for the downstream supply chain actors. And everything we do, we need to integrate with existing processes as much as possible so that change management is easier. And finally, we know that the coffee industry has been a leader for years in sustainability projects as well as other carbon projects. And we can use this Proba approach to stack with other projects and ease the pathway for farmers around the world. Greenhouse gas projects work well when 4 things really align based on what we've just discussed. The foundation is strong governance and local execution power, so that with a robust, high integrity methodology like Proba and working with trusted actors on the ground within the Concord Agriculture Partners network, we're able to execute at scale quite rapidly. And we can do this in a way that builds trust with the farmers and does not necessarily involve some of the other noise in the value chain. 2, we bring together fertilizer manufacturers and distributors to provide the low emissions product. With a strong market signal from buyers and brands, we're able to line up the appropriate amount of fertilizer to meet this year's fertilizer campaign that starts in Q3, Q4. And farmers adopt and apply it correctly. So we'll work to ensure that they have the appropriate agronomic support and know-how for this small change management activity. And then finally, and most importantly, in this process is that buyers recognize and pay for the verified emission reduction, because we are talking about farmers increasing their cost of production to meet the emission reduction goals of the sector. So we encourage you to get started with us today and join us on this journey to decarbonize coffee. So please, if you're interested, engage with Proba and Concord. We can make this scalable over time to meet your company's ambitions and the ambitions of the sector for a low carbon coffee. The outcomes will be delivered to meet your SBTi goals, regulatory reporting, and they will be done so in compliance with the greenhouse gas protocol, depending on how you define your supply shed. Commitments to source insets accelerate the impact and make the coffee sector more resilient. As we know, the coffee sector is impacted by climate change while also contributing to it. And this is a simple step forward at low incremental cost for the sector to continue its leadership in sustainability. Here are my and Sijbrand's emails for you to utilize and start reaching out to us to begin emission reductions today. So I'll hand it back to Erna for questions.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Great to have you on board. I love the way it's broken down in a practical manner. So I want to thank you again for coming on here today. Now, got a nice clapping emoji from Bruna. Now I'd like to move on to the Q&A section. So we are a bit ahead of time. So I would like to only make this segment maybe 10 to 15 minutes long. I see we have a couple of questions already. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. Now, the first thing I want to address, Shira asked at the very beginning of the webinar if the recording will be made available to the participants. Yes, so everything has been recorded, and we will share the slides with all of the people who are here today and people who are not able to make it. Now, one of my first questions that we have is actually a question I'm going to delegate to Sijbrand, which is, what are the key advantages of inhibitors and CRFs as interventions in coffee systems, maybe in compared to other abatement options? If you have an answer for us.
Look where I can find the questions. Sure, is it
So they're at the bottom right of your screen.
What are the key advantages of inhibitors? Yeah, it's a good question. A small disclaimer here: I'm not the agronomist and not the scientist, but I think there's, especially around inhibitors, there's this, I would say, advantage that these technologies are available. So basically, there's many producers out there, many distributors out there who can, well, basically make sure that the supply of this technology is there for the farmer to use. And I think the other big advantage is that the science is known. So basically, we know, also based on the work that we've done with the industry, with the International Fertilizer Association, what the emissions impact is of these technologies. So that's, I think, another big advantage. And thirdly, we think, or we assume that the technologies are, well, somewhat attractive also from a cost point of view. So from a premium point of view compared to conventional fertilizer use. So yeah, I think it's the availability, it's the, I would say, robust, I would say, extensive science around it, and I would say the attractiveness from a cost point of view. Maybe the fourth one, especially around inhibitors, they don't require major practice changes from farmers. So that's, I think, the fourth, I would say, advantage of these technologies. And to us, and maybe a fifth one, thinking out loud, is that they have a major impact on emissions. So they actually matter a lot. It's not 1 or 2%. It amounts to 40% of, I would say, reduced emissions at the fertilizer part of the emissions factor for coffee, for green beans coffee. So there's lots of emissions that are gone when you apply these technologies.
Aaron, if I may to jump in as well and build off what Sijbrand just said, is when we're within the advantages, this is a here and now immediate outcome that we're looking for in the footprint, and there is a zero chance of reversals, as with other interventions, which are also necessary as related to soil carbon or reforestation or edge of field planting of trees. Depending on the production system, the transition to low emitting fertilizers will not have a reversal potential. So you can have robust outcomes in your accounting that are guaranteed to last.
Thank you so much. Now, Kevin, I have this next question. Somebody was asking, what are serialized emissions, which were mentioned on the supply chain complexity slide?
Thanks for that, Erna, and thanks for the question. It is a very important one when we're talking about the integrity of a carbon project. Serialized emissions are when we assign a unique number to each emission reduction in a project, so that there's no double counting and a clear allocation based on this serialized number that traces back to each individual farm. And each farm is allocated a set or lot of emission reductions that will be serialized all the way through to the end buyer.
Thanks. I'm going to skip just one question and get back to it in a bit, but I have a nice question which is asking, what are the additional costs of these alternatives in percentage compared to conventional fertilizers? I'll leave this up to the both of you to say.
Shall you want to answer this question, or you want me to answer this question?
It's variable based on the distribution and supply chain and the brand and type of fertilizer that you're sourcing. It can be anywhere, I want to say, between 10 and 25%, Sijbrand, in terms of additive cost.
I think the most so it really varies per, I would say, technology type. So I think the low carbon fertilizer, so where production is much more sustainable, can be quite expensive, also on a per ton of CO2 equivalent basis. If you look at, for instance, the inhibitors again, they can be quite attractive. So a typical metric ton of product like urea is give or take $400 per ton of urea. I think the premium for adding, blending in inhibitors is around 10-20% of this price point. So that's kind of where you need to kind of work with.
Thank you. To go back, we have which was asking regarding claims, which third-party verifies Stainsert?
Thanks, Erna. When it comes to third-party validators and verifiers, we will work with those who have undertaken the Proba accreditation, and they're listed on Proba's website through the methodology, or through their approved auditors.
Yeah. Now, I also have a pretty nice question from Yakare, so I'm going to read this out. So we've referred to global project implementation. Does this include coffee value chains in Africa? They'd be curious to understand what operational or structural bottlenecks we, or us, face in these contexts and what has proven most effective in overcoming them.
That is a fantastic question. So to answer it, we can deploy a program in Africa, and it comes down to scale. As mentioned before, if we can get the right scale and ensure that we're able to work effectively with farmers and farmer associations, and then link up the value chains on both ends in terms of ensuring there's the available type of fertilizer, whether it's an inhibitor or controlled release fertilizer that is registered for use in each country, and then to ensure that the end brands are able to commit to paying for that delta and buy the insets. And Yakare, if you are interested in setting up a project in Africa, we'd welcome the opportunity. We know it's a fantastic, or there are many countries that produce fantastic coffees. I'm currently drinking an Ethiopian this morning.
And speaking more about actual projects in various places, we also have a question where the person is curious to know more about MRV implementation. They use an example that some farmers, do they have to use Excel or just use pen and paper, as some might not have reliable internet for MRV?
Yeah, that is a great question, and something that we have solved for around a number of different projects at Concord Agriculture Partners. We have set up scaled programs in the dairy sector and in a variety of other sectors, including cocoa, and we are able to adapt our data collection to meet the farmers where they're at while ensuring a high integrity outcome, and working with auditors so that they understand the capabilities or the technologies that are available to farmers who are audited, and that the auditors are culturally sensitive to that as well. So we are able to adapt based on the context in which farmers operate.
Thanks. Great. So now that I've been kind of viewing the Q&A segment of this, we have two last questions, and I'd like the second to last question to be from William, which they are asking, could this model be applied to other crops? Or are there unique aspects that make this model more applicable to the coffee supply chain?
We can apply this model to any crops. We are currently developing programs in parallel with Proba in Brazil with the sugarcane sector, and exploring row crops in the US and Canada at the moment. And so it is almost universally applicable across agribusiness wherever industrial fertilizers are used.
Maybe I can quickly add to this, Kevin. So it is indeed globally applicable across all crops and regions. I think what is kind of nice around coffee is that it's also coffee supply chains and also coffee agronomy and coffee, I would say, fertilizer related technologies is well studied, which means that there's lots of scientific evidence out there, which really proves, gives a lot of evidence on what the impact is of certain fertilizer related technologies. So yes, it can be applied across crops, but I think the certainty where we can basically provide the emission factors based on the technologies that are being used in Brazil around coffee is a bit more certain, has less uncertainty than maybe other crops where there's less, I would say, scientific studies have been done. So that is a small caveat, but then again, the technologies as such are widely studied. There's lots of data out there that can support these programs, but some, commodities like coffee are better studied than others. So in that sense, they are a good, I would say, first candidate together with to start these programs.
So I was planning to ask one last question, but we had one more roll in, so let's make these our last two. Hey guys, and we'll close off. So I know we've talked about kickstarting, we've talked about challenges, we've talked about interventions. One of the questions we had was actually, what are the challenges with scaling up? What are you going to run into there?
In terms of scaling up, there are challenges that we need to manage across both of the supply chains that we discussed. First and foremost, we need to ensure that there is a buyer at the end for the inset outcome. And once we have that, we can begin to solve the other challenges. And from the inset outcome commitment, we are able to work backwards to ensure that it is within the defined supply shed that the buyer wants and requests. And from there, we work with our partners on the ground to convince farmers to participate based on the monetary incentive, the change management, and the agronomic support that, leading to this next question, is not going to affect their yields or their practices, because farmers make a decision on fertilizer once or maybe twice a year. And then we work further upstream to work with the dealers of fertilizers to get the product in position for the fertilizer season to begin, and then ensure that it is delivered on time to the farms at the right amounts for the farmers to apply. And then from there, ensure that the farmers follow the appropriate practices, provide the data, and conform with the validation and verification processes to deliver the outcomes. So we have to work upstream and then back downstream throughout the year.
And the very last question is a pretty interesting one from Hirotomo, which asks, which is the better option, CRF or SRF? So these are nitrogen inhibitors or urease inhibitors and chemically synthesized.
I can try to answer. I don't think there's a best option. So there's emissions benefits and there's agronomic benefits of both technologies. I think the inhibitors are a bit better studied, so there's more and more science out there, but sometimes the controlled release fertilizers have, I would say, other economic benefits or maybe farmer benefits that outweigh the inhibitors. So there's also cost differences. So I don't think you can basically say, okay, well, inhibitors are better than CRF. It depends a bit on case by case. What we see in Brazil is that there's also technology providers that basically combine the technologies. So there's controls release fertilizers with blended in nitrification inhibitors, and those technologies together can achieve really, I would say, significant emission reduction results. But then again, there's a big disclaimer here. I'm not the agronomist and the scientist, but we can definitely look at a scenario or a case there if relevant.
The last slide to really close everything off. This slide is our get in touch slide. So first of all, thank you to everyone for participating and joining us here today. If this was your first sort of step towards being interested and curious about starting projects in coffee, we encourage you to reach out to us to really try and design it out. If you're already doing something, we'd also love to get involved, and we just want to leave this information here and say thank you again for joining us. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Sijbrand. And I will stop recording now.
Thank you.
Great. Great. All right, guys. I think we got everyone leaving, and yeah, I think we have one more. Cool. Cool. Great. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.